Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're thrilled to have you for this critical conversation on building networks to connect people to skills and opportunities. Our workforce development systems are in a time of tremendous change as we continue to grapple with the effects of the pandemic, the new normal of hybrid work, and shifts in the labor market. Labor shortages across the market, including in education, and remote work and learning environments are coalescing to create an inflection point, an opportunity to truly deliver equitable and human-centered education and workforce development systems. But this process requires a reimagination of how we teach, learn, and train. Strategies like community-based recruitment and preparation, work-based learning, and community college baccalaureates provide innovative approaches to meeting the needs of educators, students, workers, and employers, but requires intentionality to promote learning, define impact, and pursue scale. In today's discussion, we'll talk about how New America and Generation have built networks around these strategies to mobilize the experience and expertise of diverse stakeholders in order to identify and share best practices, center equity and expansion efforts, and increase collaboration and investment both regionally and nationally. I'm so excited to welcome Amaya, Mona, Iris, and Taylor. But before I let them introduce themselves, I'm Kevin Donnelly. I work here at the development team. And I just want to encourage you again to use the chat function to share any questions or thoughts you have throughout the conversation, because we will definitely be getting to those throughout, and we'll have a dedicated portion at the end. I also want to flag that Mona will be hopping off a little bit early, so we will make some time before she has to hop off to address any questions specifically for her. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves. Amaya, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm Amaya Garcia, and I'm Deputy Director of the Pre-K-12 team here at New America, and I help lead our GYO Educator National Network.
Great, thank you. Mona.
Hi, my name is Mona Murshid, and I'm the founding global CEO of Generation You Employed, and I'm also a New America board member.
Iris.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm Iris Palmer, and I'm Deputy Director of Community Colleges at New America, and I'm helping to launch our first network for rural community colleges to support them in creating bachelor's degrees.
Great, thank you. And then Taylor.
Hi, everybody. My name is Taylor White. I'm the National Director of New America's Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship, and I'm also a Senior Policy Advisor, for K-12 education and workforce.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves, and now we can jump right in. As I mentioned, today's conversation is all about building equitable workforce and education systems, but also about using networks as a specific strategy to amplify impact. So with that in mind, I kind of want to start off with a question that's pretty simple on its face, but I hope can sort of serve as a foundation as we go forward. Why networks? When you think about networks, what do those mean to you? And if maybe you could define how you view the networks that you're working on, I think that'd be a great place for us to start. And I'd like everybody to answer the question, so I'll turn to Amaya first.
Sorry, thanks, Kevin. So we kind of came up with this idea because we have been researching Grow Your Own educator programs, and let me just define what those are. Those are partnerships between school districts, educator preparation programs, and our community-based organizations to recruit and prepare local community members, such as high school students, teaching assistants, to teach in their local schools, and more importantly, stay teaching in their local schools. And so we have been doing a lot of research looking at programs across the country, but we noticed some gaps in terms of the availability of professional learning communities, is kind of what we call them in education, but these opportunities for people to actually engage with one another and learn from each other in a direct way. GYO is highly localized, and so there aren't a lot of opportunities nationally kind of built in to better understand how your program, fits within this larger context, but also ways to learn from other people doing the work. And so for us, the network was just a really good way to try to bring some more cohesion to the field, bring people together in a very formal and intentional way, with the goal of really helping build their capacity, help build their learning, and really help build them that opportunity for them to create a learning community amongst themselves with GYO, so that they can work together to advance the strategy as a collective, as opposed to just always doing it within isolated pockets.
Yeah, thank you. Mona.
So just as context, what Generation does is train and place adult learners into careers that would otherwise be inaccessible. And so we do this across 16 countries and 40 professions. So to your question, Kevin, as to why do we need networks to do this, whenever you're dealing with challenges like these, there are multiple planes of motion that are moving simultaneously, right? And so we think of networks at three levels. So first is the network of employers, of education and training providers, of government agencies, funders that we are bringing together to support an individual to go from being in a completely different trajectory and getting their life into a new one where they are thriving in a given career. So that is one way that the network is important. The second is across our 16 countries. So we learn a lot. Like we take something from Singapore and bring it to Mexico, and something from Mexico and take it to Kenya, and so on. And that is the power of the network, which we are building ourselves. And then lastly, I would say it's the network of our graduates. So we now have 61,000 alumni since we began our work in 2015. And so we very much seek to have our alumni support the next generation of generation by identifying job opportunities at the places where they're employed and so on. So those are the three ways that the network is crucial to the work that we do.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, especially with an organization international in scope, it becomes increasingly important. I think that's something we definitely want to discuss in this conversation. But first, I wanted to turn it over to Iris.
Thanks, Kevin. Happy to be here. So we know, and we've seen this throughout our work with community colleges, that many people in rural areas in particular live in what are called education deserts. Thank you, Nick Hillman, who did that research and really demonstrated it with the data. And so a lot of these people don't actually have access to in-person bachelor's degrees. They may have access to online bachelor's degrees, but they don't have that sort of community-based in-person access. But many of them do have access to community colleges. And so one of the things we're thinking about is how to expand the educational access to bachelor's degrees by providing employment-aligned bachelor's degrees at rural community colleges. And I think this is particularly important because we see in our rural communities that they have a hard time recruiting healthcare workers. They have a hard time recruiting teachers, as Amaya has seen in her Grow Your Own work. And so if you can educate the people who are in your local community and connected to that community in those really important occupations that really support the community and help the community thrive, then you'll be able to retain them. And so with those deep connections, we're hoping that these opportunities can help keep people in the communities where they live and support that community. So unfortunately, what we see is that many of these rural community colleges lack the capacity to start bachelor's degree programs, even in states where they're actually authorized to do so. We've done some research looking at the offerings of community college baccalaureate degrees, so four-year programs at predominantly two-year institutions. And we've really found that in rural community colleges, they are lacking. And so that's what this project's all about. We are going to create two levels of a network. The first is a really high level network that is sort of going to be email, listserv based email of us pushing out our information and then answering each other's questions. It'll be opt-in for any rural community college that's interested. And then we're also going to be launching a series of peer learning communities that are sort of sprints around a particular common challenge that these colleges face. And we really hope to help connect the colleges to each other to help answer those informations. We think that networks are a really good way to work with community colleges, and we're excited about this strategy because we think, number one, it helps these colleges see themselves in other colleges that have been successful. So they're able to visualize what it might look like for them to do this work. The second is that it actually does provide really in-depth contextualized answers to questions that we don't have the answers to because we're too high level. So not only do we learn from that, but obviously the other colleges also learn from that. And third, and I think this is a piece that gets lost in this conversation sometimes, is that it actually creates lasting relationships among people at these colleges that then pay dividends further down the line. So for instance, there was a federal investment in Missouri that created basically a network of community colleges there that's continuing to pay dividends in their healthcare workforce to this day. And those informal connections tend to live on, and they are self-fulfilling and self-promoting. So our role in this as the network convener and connector is to really help support that connection. And we already do this informally with many of the colleges that we work with. I hear from one college they're struggling with something. I know another college that's found a solution to that, and I put them together. But this will be an ongoing idea of continuing to have that engagement. And then also learning from what the colleges are telling each other and helping share that beyond the network. So that's what we're really excited to get started on this summer.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like an incredibly exciting project, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it today and as we move forward. And then Taylor, I just wanted to get your thoughts as well.
Sure. So I will echo much of what folks on the line have said, but I think perhaps tell a little bit of a different story about like our entry point into a network. So the initiative that I lead here at New America is called the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship. We launched in 2018 with the goal essentially of expanding and strengthening the field of youth apprenticeship, which was at that point in time a pretty disparate, fragmented field. And the big part of our vision was building better connections across the field to really strengthen it and introduce a level of consistency and sort of a common understanding of what quality looked like, and to really better understand through emerging leaders in the field, like what the potential was for this model of better connecting post-secondary education, secondary education, and workforce opportunities to ease the transition that young people make from high school into the world of work and really into adulthood. So we knew, as I said, that fragmentation was going to be a challenge. And we had this initial vision of seeding and supporting innovation in a really small group of places to establish strong proof points and begin developing a small community of leading youth apprenticeship programs that could help us create a shared identity, promote high standards of practice, and really give us an opportunity to learn and address some of the stickiest systems alignment challenges that we really wanted to address using youth apprenticeship as our vehicle. So initially we set our sights on selecting 8 or 10 communities around the country that we would work really closely with to do this. And so we launched an RFP in 2019, thought we'd get like 30, maybe 50 applications, and we ended up with more than 200 folks that threw their hat in the ring. And I will point out that we only accepted applications from cross-sector teams. So these were folks who were working already or had built partnerships across K-12 education, higher education, and the private sector, or a public workforce system. And these were small grants. These were not going to be huge grants, right? So the level of interest from the field was really interesting to us. We hadn't, until that point, seriously thought about expanding beyond the closed network of grantees that we'd originally envisioned. But when we saw the extent of the interest in the model and the interest in working more closely with the folks in those communities and across the communities nationally, we realized we had to come up with some way to both support the learning of these communities, but also position ourselves leading this initiative to be in a position to learn from the work that was happening in all of these different communities and to both help shape it and direct it, but also allow there to become over time a more shared identity in the field, shared language, quality standards. And we needed a way to engage folks in the field to do that. So the growth of the field and the learning was really a bit more authentic than I think we even originally envisioned it to be. So we opted at that point to launch a network and have run the PIA National Network since 2019. We have about 45 communities in the network currently. And I'm happy to talk later on at some of the kind of evolutions of what's gone on through our network. But I'll say a couple of the things that have really been beneficial to us in casting our net wider and really rethinking about New America as the hub of this network, as opposed to just running a closed network of grantees. We've been able to really successfully establish and disseminate the standards of practice for the field, create a shared identity amongst folks who 3 years ago didn't even know others were doing this work elsewhere in the country. It's helped us establish and build a knowledge base and ask and answer questions that when we launched this initiative, we didn't even know people were asking in corners of the country that we hadn't been able to necessarily work. It's been an opportunity for us to cultivate leaders around the country. Again, folks who are on the ground doing this work, who have a lot of lived expertise and lived experience to share both within their communities, but beyond as well. And it's really helped us build the case and evidence base for continued investment and support of policy at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level increasingly as well. And so it's a happy accident in some ways that we ended up launching this network, but I think the flexibility and versatility of networks for facilitating a sort of cross-site and bi-directional learning has been really powerful for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that has come across throughout the conversation so far is that there's so much to be learned within these networks from people who regularly might not even understand that there's another initiative doing similar work that they could learn from going on, which kind of brings me to my next question for you, Mona, because Generation has an international scope, which I think adds additional elements and considerations. And I'd love if you could maybe talk us through some of those considerations as you're thinking about creating partnerships across the globe.
Sure, happy to. Let me just begin by saying there has to be a reason for why an organization wants to be part of a network, right? There has to be value that is derived. And so for us, we often begin the creation of a network with our employers. And we now have 8,000 employer partners across our 16 countries, small, medium, large. And essentially, they will only come to the table, they will only hire differently than they would normally if they're solving for a problem of scarcity. You know, they want to hire 100 people, but can only find 10. Or if there is a problem of high churn, or if there is a problem with productivity, quality outcomes, and so on. So the very first kind of value that we have to create through the network is to meet that pain point. We often call it a desperation index, you know, so how desperate is the employer to come to the table? And the higher, the better from our perspective, right? So that's the first part. And just as an indicator, you know, so if I look at the last 12 months, 65% of our graduates were hired by repeat employers, right? So these are existing employers in our network who have hired from us before, who continue to hire from us. So that's the first part. Then you look on the government side, and they also have to be solving for something. So often it is that they're either looking to serve a priority community that has not been able to, or faces just significant structural disadvantage when it comes to accessing these types of employment opportunities. Or it could be that they're looking to increase job placement rates or income levels that come from programming. So that's the value that makes them want to come to the table. For our learners, I mean, obviously, you know, they face significant challenges and so on, you know, and so what we're trying to do is to identify what is the pain point that each stakeholder group has, and then how through this network we are collectively able to create the value such that everyone has a better outcome, because otherwise it doesn't work, right? So that's the central tenet of it. And so, you know, whether it's in Singapore and we're working with Skills Future and a variety of tech companies and the polytechnics, or whether it's in India and we're working with ministries and with employers and so on, you know, the configuration may look different, but the philosophy of what brings them each to the table is the same.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think something that you mentioned is the starting point really needs to be meeting a defined need. And Iris, you are working, as you said, with rural community colleges. I'd love for you to kind of talk through a little bit how community colleges are sort of positioned in the workforce space to meet a need, and why they're sort of the focal point of your network.
Yeah, thanks. I think that community colleges have been the main providers of training and education in this sort of workforce space for a long, long time. Now, community colleges have a dual mission, right? They're both supposed to train people for careers and sort of CTE programs, and also support transfer to four-year colleges, which is more of an academic pathway. And this means that really the workforce training mission is integrated into the fabric of community colleges, but it can be a little bit tough to balance some of those competing priorities. So some colleges are more focused on transfer and some are more focused on workforce development. And since community colleges are traditionally pretty under-resourced, so they really are starved for resources many times, it can be very hard for them to find the capacity to be incredibly responsive to employers and student demand. And some of them do an amazing job, a lot of them do an amazing job with this, particularly given how under-resourced they are and that all their staff have like 8 or 9 jobs and are trying to make everything work and care so much about their students. But what we're hoping to do is explore how this network strategy can help them build community and build capacity at the colleges that really have really want to do certain things, right? Some key areas where we're seeing emerging pain points, as Mona talked about, to really build out that CTE mission. So for instance, community colleges have usually seen enrollments increase during times of economic downturn. And unfortunately, in the wake of COVID-19, we've actually seen the opposite. So there's been a sort of historic drop in enrollment at community colleges before the pandemic, and that has even been more augmented since the pandemic. So we've seen over 13% official decline in enrollments at community colleges since the fall of 2019, and that's just a huge drop in people taking advantage of the education that these institutions provide. So they really need more capacity to enroll students, to reach out to students, to explain the value proposition to students of both their transfer and their CTE programs. But there is a hole in the field. There aren't a lot of networks that support community college staff at this level, helping them with enrollment, for instance. So the sort of enrollment managers at community colleges a lot of times are working on their own without much of a community practice. So using this network strategy could be a really nice way to start supporting those staff in building out additional capacity in that area. Another thing that we've seen colleges struggle with is creating high quality non-degree programs, ones that lead to graduates that get good jobs. And so while we see amazing pockets of excellence in this space as well, creating a shared network in that kind of program creation, probably sector specific around things like manufacturing, IT, and healthcare, could be another really valuable way, I think, to use these networks to build that sort of workforce positioning for community colleges that are interested in engaging with that and building their capacity in that area.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, Taylor, as you mentioned before, the PIA network that you lead is kind of going through a bit of an evolution, whereas Iris's network is just getting started. I'd love for you to kind of build off some of what she's been talking about and talk us through maybe some of the major lessons learned or next step priorities that you have in mind now that PIA is up and running.
Sure, yeah, happy to. So PIA is just coming to the end of its 4th year, and we are, as you said, Kevin, preparing to enter the next phase of work. So we're working on the strategy for that and feeling really excited about the progress that we've made to date and the opportunity to keep evolving the network. I think one of the things that's been really interesting to see is how the network has become an even more important piece of infrastructure for the field. And I do think thinking about it that way, that it's part of our mission of building this field. It's really like a tool for field building in many ways. But as we've established a lot of the key parameters that like a healthy field demonstrates and started getting some of those pieces in place, we are thinking about ways to evolve the network and how it's shaped and who's involved, and to the point that Mona made, like what the value proposition is for different kinds of stakeholders who may have come to us 3-4 years ago with one goal in mind for participating in the network, but that too has evolved over time. And so how are we finding ways to meet the different needs that are now within our network? When we launched, we had about 40 communities that were invited in. It was very, very closed. It was effective, but we were interested when the pandemic hit in just how many people were spending time online and how many people seemed to be attending virtual events. And we thought maybe this is an opportunity for us to cast our net wider, expand our network, expand our impact by doing so. And so there were parts of the network that had previously been closed that we opened up to the public. And that has been a huge opportunity for us, again, to reach more and more folks. But we've also discovered that like bigger is not uniformly better in every case. And so it's been a good learning experience for us to think about like, you know, what are the goals of this network long term? How can it change? How can it grow? And, you know, I think it's allowed us to learn a lot more about the impact that we can have. So just a couple of things I'll highlight. One is that networks can and should change and grow to meet the needs of their members. It's not always easy to do that. I think hindsight is 2020, and it takes time for these networks, like most living, breathing things, to kind of find that sweet spot. I'll also say that running networks and participating in networks requires capacity, and Iris was alluding to this. You know, one of our key goals of PIA is to ensure that we're providing direct support and capacity building to communities that are often overlooked by big national philanthropy that just cannot compete in the earliest phase for some of the grants that are going right now to support pathways work and systems alignment effort in typically in much larger school districts or catchment zones for community and technical colleges. But a lot of those communities have the hardest time participating in network activities because it does require time, it does require capacity, and many of them aren't exactly sure what they would get out of it. And so you do have to invest time in resources in helping them get what they need and want to get from a network. I'll also say that learning goes both ways, but you have to be really intentional about finding how to both disseminate knowledge and expertise through a network and how to extract it as well. I think coming in, we sort of felt like, well, we're listeners, we're learners, we'll just be able to kind of absorb some of what we're hearing and seeing from the network. And over time, I think we've become much more attuned to the intentionality that we need to bring to bear on the network to really be learning from them as much as we are learning. We hope that they are learning from us and one another. So I think, you know, one of the things that we are thinking a lot about our strategies to spread and deepen and to diversify both the participation and offerings through our network. And I'll say one of the things that's top of mind for me is kind of the pace at which you move from a very highly centralized network that has an organization like New America as an expert node holding the thing together to how you evolve over time to be a more decentralized network where there are learning hubs across the country that have really developed the expertise and capacity to take on a lot of the sort of learning functions, teaching functions, coordinating and convening functions that central hub at one time played. And that's been a great challenge for us. And I think we've got a lot of organizations that are ready to step into the fold and take on more leadership, which to us is a sign that the field is evolving and growing and maturing in really positive ways.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds really exciting. I think one of the benefits, at least from a layman, of this sort of decentralized structure is just like how much more information and data sharing can happen among the partner sites, sort of independently and organically. But Mona, I know you're hopping off somewhat soon, so I did want to mention an article you recently wrote for the Stanford Social Innovation Review about metrics monomania. And data sharing obviously is a huge benefit and attraction to be part of a network, but at the same time, nonprofits and funders often can find themselves sort of myopic around the importance of metrics. I'd love to sort of hear about your thoughts on how organizations and networks can kind of reconcile this tension.
Sure. So let me just begin by saying metrics are crucial, but having a singular focus where one metric dominates over all other metrics is what is problematic. And so particularly in the workforce space, there is often a focus on volume of graduates who are employed. Actually, just even volume of graduates. Let me forget the employed. It's just volume of graduates. And then you start getting into conversations of how do you 10x what you do? How do you 100x what you do? And that's great, you know, by all means, let's have those conversations. But the reason why I wrote the article was because that is, the volume is one part of it, but in our minds, there is also the depth of the impact which is had, so it's not just how many people have been trained, but it's what percent get employed and how much their income increases. And then there is also the durability of that outcome, right? So 2 years, 5 years down the line, are they still employed? Are they still achieving income outcomes? Are they saving for the future? What percent of their income is being saved, and so on? And so this is why, for Generation, we very much think of the three-legged stool of there is breadth, depth, and durability. And we need to move all three of these things together if we're going to have impact. And it requires often a lot of conversation so that we always talk about three with the same breath, as opposed to we only focus on the breadth, which often many stakeholders will, whether consciously or unconsciously, tend to focus on alone. And that was really the spirit of the piece. And that's also true for the network. I mean, if you're going to bring a set of players together, I'll just take the employer hat. It isn't just, how many people they hire in a year, but it's whether these people retain. It's whether they continue to be there, not just 3 months or 6 months out, but 2 years out. It's whether they are also moving vertically or horizontally and being promoted into other roles. So this notion of breadth, depth, and durability has application to each and every one of the stakeholder groups in our network, in addition to ourselves. And that was really the motivation for the article.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. And Amaya, I'd kind of love to hear your network exists at the intersection of the education and workforce development systems. I'd love to kind of have you contextualize it in those movements and talk a little bit about how GYO is thinking about both meeting the needs of the educators of the future, but also meeting the needs of those students that they're working with.
Sure. So what's interesting is that teacher preparation traditionally has not been viewed as a workforce development strategy. It sort of sits on this other side of work, but it very much aligns with the current movement to get individuals trained and equipped to meet the needs of the local labor market. So, within education, subject area shortages, such as in special education or bilingual education, and regional teacher shortages, such as rural communities, that's really helping drive the creation of many GYO programs, as is the need to increase the racial and linguistic diversity of the teacher workforce in order to better reflect students and their families, and in turn, better meet their needs, right? This is changing, however, with the new momentum for K-12 teacher apprenticeships that was spurred earlier this year when the Department of Labor approved teaching as an apprenticeable occupation. And so I think what's interesting for us at New America is actually we're trying to see a lot more overlap between the work that we do individually. So Iris was talking about GYO as a community development strategy, which it is, but then now we're bleeding over into some of the PIO work and then thinking through how all these kinds of systems and changes are connected. But really the bottom line is that we need teachers who reflect the students and the larger community, who understand and have shared experience with students and understand the realities of working in schools. And that's why people like GYO, is because we want teachers who will stay in the profession for the long term. And by that, I actually mean at least 5 years, right? Because as people grow and evolve, teaching isn't necessarily the long-term career that it once was. It's not something that you're going to necessarily do for 30 years anymore. And so I think that we need to be acknowledge that and be reflective of what that really means when we're talking about preparing teachers and what it means to stay in the profession. I also really want to be clear that the pandemic has challenged educators in unprecedented ways, and that we're seeing more states legislate what teachers can and cannot teach and say in their classrooms. And so we have a lot of external pressures being placed on teachers. And so while there's a lot of fear about a mass exodus of teachers, we haven't seen that happen yet, but I think we need to acknowledge that this is happening and that teaching is not an easy profession. And I think a lot of people overlook the realities of what it means to be a teacher and don't legislate in ways that are supportive of their needs. So really, if we backtrack to GYO, the whole idea is that if you're recruiting community members. You're going to increase retention and provide a pathway to career growth and economic ability, right? This is particularly true for paraeducators who supports teachers and students in the classroom, but on average make a median salary of about $28,000 a year, right? So they're very underpaid. So if you become a teacher, lots of times their salary will double, right? And that can be a huge incentive and momentum builder for helping more paraeducators enter the profession. The other is that if we remove barriers that have kept some people from pursuing a degree in education, we will also increase access to and persistence in educator preparation, right? And so higher education isn't necessarily built for everyone. And so I think what GYO does is you try to meet candidates where they are and create a comprehensive set of wraparound support, such as tutoring, financial assistance, cohort models, test preparation, even assistance navigating applications and admissions to kind of help people get an entry point into a teacher prep program and stay in the program, right? And for us, one of the best programs that GYO has to offer are these paid job embedded learning, lots of times as a teacher residency, where GYO candidates work under the direct guidance of a mentor teacher. And so we think that those kinds of models are really promising because of the fact that they can sort of address some of the things that are pushing teachers out, because you're giving people an opportunity to actually work in schools, or they have experience working in schools already. And so they kind of understand some of those challenges up front. We launched the GYO Educator National Network in January of 2021. And we have 14 programs across 13 states. All of these programs are focused on helping paraprofessionals or paraeducators become teachers. There are a lot of programs in the country that are focused on high school students, but as of now, our network does not include those programs. And the whole point of the network is to build a learning community where they can connect and share resources, as I already said, to strengthen local capacity of programs, to provide them with targeted resources for program and policy development, and to strengthen the evidence base on GYO by collecting data and sharing stories from the field. We're very intentional about making sure that the network was comprised of teams of people from each program, because partnerships are central to making sure GYO work. We have people from school districts, from the educator prep programs, and in some cases, the community-based organizations. So that way they're also learning together while they're also learning, with all these people from other parts of the country. And we want to make sure, that everyone has representation and a voice within the network. The way that it's structured is we have these learning sessions every month that are focused on a topic of interest, such as sustainable funding, advocacy, program evaluation, candidate recruitment, maintaining strong partnerships. And then we work with 3 external advisors to plan and facilitate these learning sessions. But we do try to rely really heavily on the network members to present their work, discuss effective practices, and to seek guidance on different approaches to the work from one another. They really enjoy hearing that from each other. They reach out directly to other network members to learn more. And then some of our advisors also make themselves available for technical assistance. So for example, someone right now is working with the program to engage in conversations with their local school district about how to use federal recovery funds to support your own programs. And so at the end of the day, the hypothesis is that, one, you're going to have people who better understand the needs of kids. They're going to stay in the schools longer. And then because of the fact that they better reflect the kids and they understand their needs more, they're going to be effective teachers. And so you're kind of see this like circular thing, and then they're going to inspire more kids to become teachers, and then they can become go into a grow your own program. And so I think that's a lot of the promise and opportunity that we see. And I think the network, again, it's a starting point for really building more cohesion amongst programs and like a better shared understanding as a field of what we mean when we talk about grow your own, because teacher preparation is there's a lot of ways that you can prepare teachers. And so grow your own fits in there. But I think we need to do more work to really say, this is what we mean when we talk about grow your own.
Thank you. Yeah, and something that you touched on was both the consideration given to the needs of the educators, but also how you're sort of engaging the students in this process as well. I think stakeholder engagement is something that you've all mentioned as being incredibly important, but I'd love, Taylor, Iris, and Mona, I'd love to hear a little bit more about not just how you're engaging your network partners, but also how you're engaging the people you hope your networks serve at the end of the day. In the process of, designing the network or thinking about how you might be able to better do your work, because I think when we're thinking about equitable systems, have people having a voice in designing those systems is an incredibly critical part of that. And I'll pass it over to Mona first.
So just a quick thought on one of the populations whom we serve. So we serve adult learners of all ages, one of which are those who are mid-career, so age 45 plus. And one of the things we found is that there is often hesitancy to engage in a new career, not because of an inability to learn, not at all, but it's because they have real life situations that they are grappling with. And also they are doubtful of a channel that is different from the channels that they know. And so we began and we've begun experimenting with ways to partner with their trusted channels, if you will, in order to, one, enable them to have a smoother transition, as well as to give them confidence that this is actually a path that can have support. So that's, and so we're actually in the midst right now of doing extensive research to understand what's been critical for those mid-careers who have come through our programming. What are ways that we can counter some of the challenges that have prevented mid-careers from wanting to enter into our programming through whichever channel, simply because of, as I said, real life situations. And then also how to make sure that at our employers, that when our mid-careers enter, that they are also not confronting ageism bias, which often is the case. And so this is the entire chain, which we're currently working through and very actively engaging with mid-careers, both in our network and those not in our network, so that we can get it right.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. Taylor, I'd love to kind of hear, because you mentioned in the evolution of PIA, you've been thinking about how you can engage folks better. I'd love to hear some of what you're thinking about.
Sure. So I guess one thing I sort of have two ways of answering this question. The first that I'll say in thinking about just building off Mona's response, the sort of end user of what we do, right, is students, it's young people. And so we do think a lot about how we're reaching youth. We do this in a couple of kind of structured ways through things like focus groups. We're working with one of our grantees and network members right now to administer some focus groups on the ground to better understand how young people receive information about post-secondary opportunities, what they're hearing, how they make selections, who influences their decision, et cetera. And so we're doing that with young adults in a handful of communities across a particular state and their parents to better understand where there is alignment and disconnection between what those two groups of key decision makers are hearing, learning, thinking. We've also done some work to promote our network members' ability to engage youth voice in program design. So we last year experimented with a youth voice design sprint where we had 3 network members come to us virtually with cross-sector, cross-partner teams that had both young adults and adults from their communities to plan recruitment processes to better understand essentially how information is getting out to young people and what kind of authority they're being given to help make meaningful decisions about the programs that that are available to them. So we do quite a bit of work. And I think it's fair to say that that's sort of a trend in the field, is to do more to engage youth and community voice in program development and implementation. And that's certainly something we're trying to learn about and support our folks. And as we're developing a strategy for the future, something we would like to dedicate some sort of time and resources towards making sure that we're helping build the capacity on the ground to do that. The other side of the equation, I would say, is like in between us and them are these really dynamic local partnerships. And so Amaya alluded to this point that in the GYO network, similar to PIA, that our members are actually partnerships of organizations that are collaborating at the local level. And so one of the things that we've done to really try to reach them is create smaller learning communities that are intentionally sort of mixed level. And by that, I mean state level operators and local operators from the public and private sector in learning communities together. And we've done that in part because it's helpful for us to kind of watch them grapple with issues differently and with one another. So as just one like prime example, we have a data work group that we convene through our network. Some members are grantees of ours with whom we work very closely. Others are our network members we don't know quite as well. And one of the things that we've seen in that group is that folks are much more willing to talk about the difficulties of working across systems with people across systems in other states. So someone from Iowa who's working at the local level feels pretty comfortable talking about why it's hard to work. I'm making this up. If anyone on the line is from Iowa, this is a non-illustrative example. It's completely random selection. Amaya, I think you're from Iowa. Sorry in advance. I'll throw both of my colleagues here. Minnesota and Iowa. Local folks on the ground in one place can have a really candid conversation with a state leader from another state in a way that they would not necessarily have with folks in their own state, which has been a really interesting learning for us. One of our big goals is driving systems alignment conversations and using youth apprenticeship as the thing that brings people together to have those conversations. And so we have an opportunity to really listen from and cater our programming to our members by intentionally putting them in these situations where the problems that they're grappling with have to be tackled in safe environments where they've managed to build a degree of trust, because they're lower stakes, frankly, than they would be if they were surrounded by their immediate colleagues with whom they have closer proximity. So that's been another way that we sort of collect and solicit information to guide what it is we're doing and make sure we're having an impact. But easy answers, surveys is a big one. We survey our members all the time, a couple of times a year. And we're increasingly trying to figure out how to customize those surveys for different stakeholder groups to better understand some of the nuances and how we can support them.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Iris, I'd love to hear, since you're sort of just getting a network off the ground, what you've built in so far and what you're thinking about.
Yeah, so we have two pieces that I would say are influencing sort of stakeholder engagement in the design of the network up front. One, we're creating an advisory committee of people who work at rural colleges, people who work in national organizations that support rural colleges in different ways, of researchers who do a lot of the data collection and analysis of rural colleges, and then some people around economic development and some other sort of ancillary areas to help really advise what we focus on and how we focus the network and who we should recruit and how we should recruit them and how we should work with them. So in that, we found advisory committees to be incredibly valuable to both as group meetings where they can really sort of pick each other's brains and they can kind of iterate off each other, and also in one-on-one consultations where we learn more about their stories and what they do, and we can ask them very specific questions, and then also elevate some of the work that they do to support our network. So we're very excited about that, and we're currently pulling that together. The other piece that we're doing is we're going to be doing a really in-depth needs analysis over the next year that looks at what are the challenges that these colleges really face and what are the topics that make the most sense to bring colleges together around. What do they really need help with? So we'll be doing a series of interviews. We'll be working with the advisory committee, and we'll be doing some literature review and some other research strategies to figure out what should those focus areas be and who might be the colleges that really want to work in depth on these particular challenges. So right now, that's how we're thinking about engaging our networks. I think as the network gets going and starts to hopefully coalesce, we'll be doing more of the surveys, some more of the engaging student voice, some of these other pieces that you hear about in more mature networks.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the best benefits of a network is having that constant sort of feedback loop and opportunity to hear from folks. So excited to see how that develops within the Rural Community College Baccalaureate Network. Amaya, I know you had discussed some of how you engage stakeholders. I want to make sure you touched on everything. If you had anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about our network is, in some ways they're all stakeholders, right? They all have there's a lot of implications for them, the kinds of policies that are out there. But I think part of what we're trying to do is actually help them be more informed and active stakeholders, like in the policy making process. A lot of them are interested in advocacy strategies and how do they communicate about what their program is doing and the need, right? Because one big challenge in GYO is sustainable and predictable funding streams, because a lot of them are funded, on 2-year cycles from state funded money. And so I think that's one thing that we're trying to do is we give them a lot of guidance on this of the policies that are happening, but here's the ways that you can advocate and really make yourself heard to try to be part of the policy process and making sure that these programs continue to be funded for the long term.
Yeah, obviously that is an incredibly important piece. I did want to turn it over to some audience questions. I just will mention to everyone, I've seen a few folks asked about the acronyms and the name of programs, links to the articles. We will be sure to share all that in a follow-up email. So please don't worry about that. But I did want to start with a question from Veronica, which I think is a pretty interesting one. How do you keep networks fresh? Like over time, do you see a drop off in rigorous participation, and what can you do about that? And I'll start with you, Taylor.
All right, fine. It's a great question, and it's definitely top of mind for us at the moment. When we launched the PIA network, and for folks asking for the acronyms, that's the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship initiative that we at New America run, but we do that with our several national partner organizations who play a leading role in keeping our network going, and also delivering technical assistance and learning opportunities to our grantees. I would say when we launched the network, one of the things that we realized was that we had kind of a mix of folks who were new to the field and moving quickly, and they really wanted a lot of startup support. And because that was a common demand, we were able to meet it. Over time, as we have provided resources and learning opportunities to those folks, some of them have really hit the ground running and they've made a ton of progress. Others have not, for a host of reasons, the least of which is certainly not the pandemic. I think one of the things that we're thinking about is how you create a network that works for both. And they come to the network with very different needs and demands, and differentiating the learning opportunities that we and our partners provide is one way that we know that we can better address the different levels of expertise that are coming into the network. I think Kevin's question just a moment ago about how you get information from the network and learn from the folks who are participating, it is a big part of it. So we recently kicked off a work group through the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship focused on the skilled trades and developing youth apprenticeship and high quality work-based learning opportunities in skilled trades. This came in part from demands from the network, folks who basically said, we've been able to launch these programs in IT or healthcare, but for whatever reason, we cannot get a toehold in these other industries that are high growth, high wage in our industries, or we have questions that we would like to address with a community of like-minded folks around the sort of working conditions and equity considerations of these fields to understand, should we be designing pathways into them? And so that was new and high demand, and just really came from the ideas that were generated from the network itself. So I think being willing to listen to the network and being adaptive is a big part of it. I will say the inflexibility as folks who are, the flexibility of networks is both a blessing and a curse, right? So we can adapt all day long to meet their needs, but at the end of the day, we face our own capacity constraints and learning goals through the network that we have to constantly balance against the demands of the field. And so part of this conversation on our part about decentralizing is how can we figure out over time how we can make sure that the network is learning and evolving and sort of adding these new work streams to remain fresh and relevant, while we also preserve some of our space to continue being intentional about learning it and shaping some of the parts of the network activities that we feel are critical to maintaining quality and equity in the field.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely want to touch on, because there was another audience question about sort of like the jobs and industries that we've seen as trending and exciting for employers and employees. But Amaya, I just wanted to get your thoughts if you had anything additional to add about just like keeping the network fresh.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really fair question, I think, and something that we think about and struggle with a little bit, since we're basically a year and a half into our network. And what's interesting is, when we first started, we kind of had like True Blue group is what I call them, and they're basically stayed with us throughout the whole time. We haven't had a lot of drop off. I'd say we have 20 people who are really solidly involved and really excited to be in it. But what's been interesting is we're actually bringing them all together in DC for the first time this week. And so I think acknowledging sort of that Zoom fatigue that people have and creating those kind of in-person opportunities, I think is more important now than maybe it was even before, because of the fact that so much of this has had to happen online. And so I think that has been serve to kind of help keep people motivated and excited about the work is because they know, well, not just that they get to come here, but they're actually going to get to meet and make better, stronger relationships with one another. But I think it's also having to think through like, how long is someone in a network, right? And how does that evolve over time? Do they stay for a fixed amount of time, like 2 years, and then they become program alumni? Like trying to really think like, what are those on and off ramps into the network, and making sure that they're flexible so that people don't feel like, oh, I'm stuck in this network for the rest of my life, right? It's about no, and if you have another colleague who you want to bring in, bring them in, like it's sort of fluid in that way. And I think that helps.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important too, to keep in mind is, like what does this look like over its life cycle? And as I mentioned, we definitely had a question about sort of the jobs and industries that, we see as trending or in need from employers, and also of interest for workers and learners. And so Iris, I'd love to kind of hear from you about how you're thinking about that as you're bringing on new network partners.
Yeah, so we're actually thinking about this in several ways. One, we are thinking about how community colleges can connect better with the emerging jobs and the sort of innovation economy that the federal government funds. So right now, federal government mostly works with research universities and university centers and organizations like that around sort of emerging jobs in different areas like AI and biotech and some of these other emerging manufacturing techniques, photonics, things like that. They mostly work with universities, but we know that all of these industries are going to have technician level workforce needs. And so we're really trying to be deliberate and think about how to bring community colleges into those sort of emerging areas so we have more equity and more paths for people into these good jobs that are emerging in the future. So that's one piece. For the community college baccalaureate piece, it's really important because many occupations are increasing their education requirements to bachelor's degrees, right? So health is a really good example of this. Allied health programs have traditionally been programs where you can even get in at a certificate level, and they've gone to an associate's degree level. Some of them have gone to bachelor's, some of them have gone all the way to doctorate and created new programs down at the associate's degree level. But the point is like all of them are up credentialing in a lot of ways. And this has always been the bread and butter of community colleges and something that they've served very, very well. And so having the ability to offer bachelor's degrees, particularly in things like respiratory therapy, nursing, some of these others where they've always been the supplier of these workers in their communities, but they're now requiring bachelor's degrees is just really, really important. And so I would say those are the two things we're seeing, so sort of broad and more specific.
Yeah, thank you. And I know we're coming up on time. Taylor, I definitely wanted to get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick thing on that, because I think it's a good way to tie together a lot of what folks have said today on this industry point, right? So the question sounds like what industries are kind of hot right now for employers. Mona made a point earlier about metrics, and if you're always focused on just scale, you're missing a part of the pie. And one of the things I would say that's really useful about networks is, yes, there's a lot of demand from employers in a host of different industries and occupations. Sometimes the thing that employers want most and need most is not what's best for young people and learners. And one of the things that a network can do is assert and share resources to help local programs navigate that tension. And so part of what our network has done is set standards, right? We have quality standards, we have program definition standards, and we see a key role of ours in the network is making sure that local programs have the tools and resources that they need to make good decisions about selecting quality jobs and quality occupations and quality education partners to help create pathways that really do expand opportunity rather than narrowing them. If you're always chasing that number, enrollment 10 times, 10x, 100x, as Mona said, sometimes quality falls by the wayside. And one thing that we can do in leading networks that all of us leads is make sure that quality is really driving that conversation, and you are really finding ways to sort of balance the sometimes competing needs of the different stakeholders in these groups. So lots of industries, IT, healthcare, you've heard a bunch of them, but we're focused on quite a few, and really job quality drives many of the decisions we make.
I think that is an incredibly important point, and a great way to cap off the conversation, because I know we're at time a little bit over actually. But I did just want to say thank you to all of our panelists today for a great conversation, and to all of you for the insightful questions and the engagement. We will be sure to follow up with links to the articles and some other relevant publications and keep you updated as our networks continue to grow. Thanks, everybody.